I am 64 years old, and I do not feel 64. I feel something closer to relieved. That is not a word most men my age use when they talk about where they ended up, but it is the only honest word I have. My name is not important. What happened to me is, I spent 38 years working for a regional logistics company out of Knoxville, Tennessee. Started in the warehouse at 26, loading trucks in the summer heat with a bad radio and a thermos of black coffee. Retired as a regional operations manager. I was never rich, not by any standard that would impress anyone at the cocktail party, but I was comfortable. I owned my home outright. I had a pension. I had savings. I had a wife named Helen who made the best biscuits in Knox County and who laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. Helen died in March of 2021. Pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. 8 weeks is not enough time to say everything you needed to say for 31 years. You think it will be. It is not. I want to be honest about what those first months looked like, because it matters to the rest of this story. I was not functioning the way a man should function. I was present in my body, but absent in every other way. I paid my bills on time because I had set up autopay years earlier, and the autopay did not know my wife had died. I ate cereal for dinner more nights than I want to admit. I watched television without watching it. I answered phone calls without really hearing them. My children called more in those first weeks than they had in the previous 3 years combined. I have 3 children. My oldest son, Preston, is 41. He lives in Asheville with his wife and 2 kids. My daughter, Renata. Wait. No, not Renata. I need to get this right. My daughter's name is Colleen. She is 38. She lives 20 minutes from the house I grew up in, which she always considered some kind of moral achievement. My youngest, Danny, is 34. He was living in Charlotte at the time, working a string of jobs that never quite became a career. They all came for the funeral. They stayed a week. I was grateful. I told them so. Then the week ended, and they went home, and I was alone with 31 years of shared belongings and a silence so complete it had a texture to it. About 3 weeks after they left, Colleen called and said she was worried about me rattling around in that big house by myself. I told her I was fine. She called again the following week. Same concern. Then Preston called. Then Danny called. They were coordinating, I realized, though I did not think much of it at the time. I thought it was kindness. Colleen suggested she come stay with me for a while, help me sort through Helen's things, get the house organized, make sure I was eating real meals. I said yes because the silence was becoming something I could not describe to anyone who had not felt it themselves. She stayed for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, she cleaned out Helen's closet, reorganized my kitchen, set up my online banking on her phone so she could help me keep track of things, and told me more than once that the house was too big for one person and that at my age, rattling around in 4 bedrooms was not practical. I did not register any of this as a pattern. I registered it as help. After Colleen went home, Danny showed up. He said he was between jobs and could use a change of scenery and thought maybe he could help me out around the house for a bit. I said fine. I was genuinely glad for the company. Danny stayed for 2 months. During those 2 months, Danny borrowed $3,000 to cover his car insurance and a bill he was behind on. Then another $1,500 for a deposit on a place he was going to rent in Charlotte when he went back. Then another $2,000 because something came up that he never explained clearly, and I did not press him on it because pressing people had never been my nature. He did not go back to Charlotte. He said the apartment fell through. He asked if he could stay another month. I said yes. I want to pause here and tell you something about grief that nobody prepares you for. Grief does not make you sharp. Grief makes you soft in places you did not know you had. You want to be needed. You want to feel like you were doing something useful. When my son sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me he was struggling, I did not think, this is manipulation. I thought, at least I can help with this. At least I can do this one thing. That is the gap they drove a truck through. Preston came to visit in the fall, about 7 months after Helen passed. He brought his wife and the kids, which I loved. We had a good weekend. On the last evening, after his wife had put the grandkids to bed, Preston sat with me on the back porch and said he had been thinking about my situation. He said the house was a significant asset and that at some point I should think about what I wanted to do with it. He said he and his wife had been talking, and if I ever wanted to sell, they would be interested in buying it from me at a fair price. A family price. I said I would think about it. What I did not know was that at the same time Preston was having that conversation with me on the porch, His wife had already been in contact with a real estate attorney in Knoxville about how property transfers within families were handled. I did not find that out until much later. Through that winter, the borrowing continued. Danny was still living with me, contributing nothing to the household, and the requests had become routine enough that I had stopped thinking of them as requests. He would mention a problem. I would write a check. By February, I had given Danny just over $40,000 in what I was calling help, and what any outside observer would have called something else entirely. Colleen called regularly, and she had taken on the role of managing my calendar, my appointments, and increasingly my anxiety about paperwork and finances. She told me I did not need to worry about any of it. She told me she had talked to Preston, and they both agreed I needed to take better care of myself and not stress over numbers. She said she would help me stay on top of things. She said this in a tone that was gentle and concerned, and that I would later understand was calculated. One afternoon in March, about a year after Helen died, I was looking for something in the spare bedroom where I kept my files. Old tax returns, insurance documents, that sort of thing. I found a folder I did not recognize. Inside was a printed email chain between Colleen and Preston. I will not quote it word for word, but the substance of it was this. They had been researching the process for establishing a conservatorship over a parent who was showing signs of diminished capacity. One email referenced a specific Tennessee statute. Another email, from Colleen, said that Danny's presence in the house was, quote, useful for now as long as he does not push too hard too fast. I stood in that spare bedroom for a long time. I did not cry. I did not shake. I felt something go very quiet inside me. The way a room goes quiet when someone turns off an appliance you did not realize was running. I put the folder back exactly as I found it. I went and made myself a cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about what I actually knew, versus what I suspected, versus what I could prove. I knew that Danny had borrowed over $40,000 and had no plan to repay it. I suspected that Preston and Colleen had been planning something considerably larger than I had understood. I needed to know what I could prove. I did not say a word to Danny that evening. We watched television. He ate most of the leftover chili I had made. I asked him if he had heard from any employers, and he said a couple of prospects looked promising. I nodded. I went to bed. The next morning, I called a friend from my years in logistics, a man named Ted who had retired from his own company and who I trusted completely. Ted was sharp in a way that made lawyers nervous. I told him what I had found. I told him everything, going back to the week after Helen's funeral. Ted listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I appreciated most about him. When I finished, Ted said, "You need two things. You need an elder law attorney and you need a forensic accountant." I had never heard the phrase elder law attorney before in my life. Within a week, I had hired both. The forensic accountant began pulling records. What came back was worse than I had calculated on the worst night of my imagining. In addition to the $40,000+ Danny had borrowed directly, there were 11 transfers out of a joint account Helen and I had maintained, which Colleen had access to through the online banking she had set up on her phone. Those transfers totaled $67,000. The earliest one had occurred 4 days after Danny moved in. The most recent had occurred the previous month. $67,000. Transferred in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic flags. Transferred to an account I did not recognize, which the forensic accountant eventually traced to a business account in Colleen's name that I had not known existed. I sat with my attorney for a long time the afternoon she walked me through the documentation. She was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain in a manner that was calm in a way I found steadying. She said, "What do you want to do?" I said. "I want to make sure this never happens again." She said, "That's a good goal. What else?" I told her I wanted to sell the house. I told her I wanted to put my affairs in order in a way that I controlled, and I told her I did not want to spend the rest of my healthy years fighting with my children in a courtroom. She nodded and said, "We can work with that." The first thing I did was remove Colleen's access to every account, all of it, same afternoon. I transferred my savings to a new account at a different institution, one no one in my family had ever heard me mention. I put a freeze on my credit. I called the Social Security Administration and updated my direct deposit information. I changed every password on every financial account I had. Then I called a real estate agent I had found independently, a woman who had no connection to anyone in my family, and I listed the house. I did not tell my children. I want to explain something about that decision, because I know how it sounds. I was not acting out of spite, though I will admit there was a period of about 4 days where spite would have been an accurate word. What I was acting out of was a very clear-eyed understanding that my children had not been operating in good faith, and there was no version of this conversation that would produce a good outcome if I telegraphed my moves in advance. Danny figured out something was happening about 2 weeks after I had made the financial changes. When he tried to use a card I had once added him to as an authorized user and it declined. He came to find me in the garage where I was sorting through some of Helen's gardening tools, and he asked me what was going on. I told him the card had been canceled as part of a general account reorganization. I told him in the same tone I would use to tell him the weather. He said, "Dad, are you okay?" I told him I was fine. He said, "You know you can talk to me, right, about anything." I looked at my son, my youngest, the one I used to take fishing on the river outside of town when he was small enough that the rod was too heavy for him. I looked at him, and I understood that the person I remembered was still somewhere inside the person standing in front of me. But I also understood that the person standing in front of me had taken money from his grieving father, and had lived in that father's house for over a year without paying a dime of rent or contributing a single bill, while his siblings planned to have that father declared legally incompetent. I said, "I know, son." I did not say anything else. The house listed at $780,000. In a market like Knoxville in 2022, it moved quickly. We had an offer inside of 11 days. $760,000. Conventional financing, 30-day close. I accepted it. 30 days later, I sat in a title company's conference room and signed my name 31 times, and walked out with a cashier's check that I deposited into the new account at the new institution, less the realtor's commission and closing costs, which came to roughly $43,000. The net proceeds were $717,000. I was not in that house when the new owners took possession. I had already left. 3 weeks before closing, I had moved the things that mattered to me into a storage unit and driven myself to a furnished apartment in a city I am not going to name here. I took 3 boxes of books, Helen's cast iron skillet, a photograph from our honeymoon, and a dog I had adopted 6 months earlier named Biscuit, who was a 12-pound terrier mix with opinions about everything and an apparently boundless enthusiasm for car rides. I left no forwarding address. I did not call. I did not send a text. What I did was hire my attorney to send 3 certified letters. 1 to Preston, 1 to Colleen, 1 to Danny. Each letter was written by me and reviewed by her. The letter to Preston said that I was aware of the research he and his wife had done regarding conservatorship proceedings. It said that I was in excellent health, in full possession of my faculties, and that I had taken steps to ensure that scenario would never be necessary. It said I hoped he would reflect on what it meant to have looked into legally removing his father's autonomy before his father had even finished grieving his mother. The letter to Colleen said I was aware of the $67,000. It said my attorney had filed a civil complaint and that she would be hearing from the court. It said that whatever she told herself about her reasons, she had stolen from her father while he was in the worst year of his life. It said I did not hate her. It said I was deeply, permanently disappointed. The letter to Danny said I loved him. It said I always had, and I always would. It said the $42,000 he had borrowed would not be pursued in court, and that I considered it his inheritance paid early, paid in full. It said I hoped he found his way. It said I would not be in contact, and I asked him not to try to find me. The civil case against Colleen was settled 14 months later. She repaid $67,000 plus legal fees. I did not attend the settlement conference. My attorney handled it. When she called me afterward to tell me it was done, I was sitting on a small patio outside my apartment with Biscuit asleep across my feet, drinking a cup of coffee and watching a pair of cardinals in a pyracanthan bush. I said thank you and hung up and sat there for another hour. I want to tell you what my days look like now, because I think it matters. I wake up around 6:30 most mornings. I make coffee in the same pot I have had for 15 years. I take Biscuit on a long walk in the early light before the heat comes up, and I think about whatever I feel like thinking about. I have a gym membership at a place 3 blocks from my apartment, and I go 4 mornings a week. My doctor says my blood pressure is better than it was when I was 50. I have made 2 friends in this city. Real friends. Men I met through a hiking group I joined last fall, and we have breakfast at a diner on the first Saturday of every month, and argue about baseball and local politics and whether the pancakes have gotten worse since they changed owners. I think about Helen every day. I talk to her sometimes, which I understand is a thing that widowers do and which I have decided not to be embarrassed about. I think she would have wanted me to do exactly what I did. I think she would have used sharper words than I used in those letters. She was more direct than me in most things. I have one grandchild I think about often. Preston's oldest, a boy of 9 who used to call me Pop, and who has a way of finding the most interesting rock in any given parking lot. I think about him. I hope his parents are raising him to be better than they were to me. I believe that is possible. I also understand that I may not be in his life to see it. That is the part that costs me something. Everything else, I have made my peace with. I am 64 years old. I have a dog named Biscuit and a patio and a gym membership and 2 friends who argue with me about baseball. I have $717,000 in an account that no one in my family knows exists. I have a pension that covers my monthly expenses with room to spare. I have a life that belongs entirely to me. I built it. Nobody gave it to me. And nobody is going to take it. If you are watching this and you recognize something in what I described, I want you to hear this. You do not owe your grief to people who are counting on it. Grief is not weakness, but letting people exploit it. Staying soft when someone is using your softness against you, that is something you can stop. It took me a year longer than it should have. I am telling you now, so maybe it takes you less time. Where are you watching this from? Leave it in the comments. I want to know I am not the only one. I have thought about this a lot. In the quiet mornings when it is just me and Biscuit and the coffee going cold on the patio table. I have thought about what actually happened, not the dramatic version, not the version where I am the hero and they are the villains, but the plain, honest version. And what I keep coming back to is this. Nothing that happened to me was accidental. Every piece of it followed from something. I was generous without being paying attention. That is not a virtue. That is carelessness dressed up as kindness. When Danny asked for that first $3,000, I did not ask when he planned to repay it or how. I did not ask because asking felt unkind, and I just buried my wife and I needed to feel like I was still capable of doing something good for somebody. I filled my grief with giving, and giving without discernment is not love. It is an open door with no lock on it. Colleen did not become the person who stole from me overnight. She became that person in small steps, each one made easier by the fact that I never pushed back on the step before it. She offered to manage my online banking and I said fine. She reorganized my kitchen and I said thank you. She told me not to worry about the numbers and I nodded. I handed her a key to everything I had, piece by piece, because I was tired and sad and it felt easier than being present. Everything that followed from that was a consequence I had partially authored. I am not saying it was my fault. I am saying that passivity has a cost, and I paid it. Preston researched conservatorship laws while his kids played in my backyard. That is not a thing a person does impulsively. That is a thing a person does after a long time of looking at their parent as a resource, rather than a human being. And I have to ask myself when that started. When did I teach my children that my value to them was financial? I do not have a clean answer to that. I know I worked a lot when they were young. I know I showed love through providing more than through presents. I am not flagellating myself over it, but I am honest about it. The dynamic they tried to exploit in my grief did not appear from nowhere. What I did when I found that folder in the spare bedroom, pulling my accounts, hiring Ted's attorney, listing the house quietly, writing those letters, none of that was revenge in the way people use that word. It was the first time in about 14 months that I had acted like a man who respected himself. That is what it felt like. Not triumph, not anger. Just the sensation of standing up straight again after a long time hunched over. The resolution I reached was not perfect. I lost something with my children that I do not think is coming back, and I have made my peace with that in the way you make peace with anything that cannot be undone, slowly, imperfectly, on an ongoing basis. But I did not lose my dignity. I did not lose my home on someone else's terms. I did not end up in a conservatorship managed by people who were counting the square footage of my house before I was cold. What I know now that I wish I had known the week after Helen died, grief is not a reason to stop thinking. It is actually the most important time to keep thinking, because that is exactly when the people who mean you harm will move. Not out of cruelty necessarily, out of opportunity. Colleen did not wake up one morning and decide to become someone who steals from her father. She saw a window and she walked through it because the window was open. Keep the window closed. Know your numbers. Know who has access to what and why, and understand that love, real love, the kind worth keeping, does not require you to disappear into someone else's plans for your life. I am 64. I have biscuit and a patio and 2 friends who argue baseball with me on Saturday mornings. I built this, and I intend to keep it.